It's Nate. We are entering some pretty uncharted territory here with the distance learning that's going to have to happen because of the COVID-19 virus. And while we have been preparing for e-learning days and we're able to successfully do one this year, this is going to look a little different. We're not talking about creating a lesson because of one inclement weather day where we could review the content that we were already teaching in our classrooms. We're going to be out for a while, at least a couple of weeks. So we aren't going to be able to just pause learning and review things we've covered so far this year for that many weeks. We are going to have to start implementing new material, and we're going to have to do that in an online digital format. So I know that's uncharted territory for a lot of you. It's something that I have spent a lot of time thinking and studying. So I did want to share some things that you might want to consider as you begin planning these online lessons for your students. So I have 5 important student interactions for you guys to think about as you're planning these lessons. Your students are going to interact with the content you're giving them in 5 distinct ways, and I want you to think about each of these ways as you plan your lessons. So let's look at the first interaction that your students have, and that is the interaction between the student and the interface. This is probably the last one you'll think about when planning your lesson, but it's the first one that students are going to encounter. So when I'm talking about student interface interaction, I'm talking about whatever vehicle you're using to get your lesson to your students. So for a lot of us, that's going to be whatever learning management system we're using. So that could be Canvas, that could be Google Classroom. I know many of you are using those tools in your classrooms regularly anyway, so that's not going to be completely new for your students. If you do not usually use an LMS in your classroom, there is going to be a learning curve here. Fortunately, especially at the secondary level, your students are using those tools in at least some of their classrooms, so like things like logging in aren't going to be completely new. But we do need to consider what it's like when our students are going to be interacting with whatever interface we're using. Some of you aren't going to be using a learning management system, perhaps. Perhaps your lesson is going to be in some HyperDoc form. Maybe you have a choice board or a lesson built out in a Google Slide or Google Doc presentation. The same is going to be true about their interaction with that as it is with an LMS. So first, you want to make sure it's easy to navigate. You don't want, your landing page on Canvas, your homepage on Canvas to be overly cluttered. Your HyperDoc, same thing. You should be able to navigate through that HyperDoc with, never having seen it before. Consider your parents when you're thinking about these, especially your parents that are going to be helping their students work through these lessons who maybe don't have experience with Canvas or Google Classroom or HyperDocs. The navigation portion of those should be easy and as simplified as possible. The content in them should be organized and structured. So if you're using an LMS, take advantage of the built-in features that already do that. So like in Canvas, that's using the module feature, or in Google Classroom, using topics, so that your activities and content are organized in a structured way. Same with HyperDocs. If you're using Google Slides to deliver your content, maybe each slide should be have a very specific purpose, a specific lesson. There should be a structure to the way that you are providing the content to your student. And this should be consistent. If you're using Canvas to deliver your lessons, you should be using Canvas every week. The formatting in which you're delivering your content in a HyperDoc or Google Classroom or whatever should be consistent week after week. Don't, the lesson and the type of activities you're doing, obviously you want to mix up so it doesn't get monotonous for students and stays engaging. But the delivery format and the way the student is interacting with the interface should be consistent. The second student interaction is the big one, obviously. It's how the student is going to interact with whatever content that you are providing them in the lesson. So how is the student going to be interacting with the readings you're providing, the videos you're asking them to watch, the digital tools that you're asking them to respond with, the papers they're writing, whatever the content is. So first and foremost, the directions for the activities need to be clear. Over-explain. Don't leave your students and your parents guessing on what they're expected to do. And then in hand with that, don't make them guess how they're supposed to submit those activities. So do you want them to turn things in through Canvas? Do you want them to take a picture of what they did and email it to you? However they're supposed to be submitting their work needs to be just as clear as the directions. The content needs to be easy to access. So as simplified as we can make getting to the reading they're supposed to do, the blog post you want them to read, the video you want them to watch. Make that process as easy as possible. Because we're doing these things digitally, provide hyperlinks whenever you can. So if I'm going to ask my students to go to chapter 12 of their online textbook and read section 1, instead of just stating that, I'm going to provide a link to the online textbook. If possible, I'm going to provide a link to chapter 1 or chapter 12, section 1. But be as direct as you can with how you're asking them to access this material. Obviously, make sure the material you're providing them is appropriate. I didn't necessarily mean appropriate for school. I'm assuming you guys are all professional enough to know that. But I'm also talking about, like grade level appropriate. You're going to be, in some cases, hunting for a good online resource. Maybe you had an activity in class you were planning on doing that doesn't really translate to online, and now you're trying to find a resource to supplement, and all you find is maybe an article written for a college level course. Are your students able to really comprehend that? You need to think about that. The opposite is true in the opposite direction. So, if you're teaching high school and you find a resource that was clearly made for elementary school, your students are going to pick up on that and they're going to disengage. So try to find grade level appropriate content, and then make sure each lesson does have a purpose. I know this is difficult and digital content is new for some of us, but if you are throwing up a digital worksheet onto Canvas just to give your students something to do and it doesn't really have a purpose, your students are going to sniff out that busy work and they are going to disengage. So make sure the content you're assigning does have a purpose as well. The third interaction is instructor interaction. So again, just because we're talking about online learning doesn't mean we're trying to eliminate you as the teacher. You are the most valuable resource in this time that the students have. So consider the tools that you have that will still allow you to interact with your students even from a distance. Screencastify and Screencast-O-Matic are both screen recorders that I'm using one of them right now. You can record your screen, you can record your voice. I would highly, highly encourage you to, instead of typing out the directions for your lessons, to record a video of yourself explaining what is expected. Your students, I believe, will take comfort in seeing you feeling like, yes, this is very unusual to be doing all of this work from home, but there is some continuity with what I'm used to. There is my instructor. I can see and hear them. We're kind of all in this together sort of situation. And I truly believe your students will be more engaged if it is literally you they see and hear explaining their lessons. Flipgrid is another way for you to interact with students. If you guys haven't explored that resource, I've provided some links to some tutorials there. We can meet and talk about it. But it's just a great way for you to provide a prompt and for your students to actually record videos back to you. And you can have an ongoing conversation with them. So record directions. If you want to record short lectures, keep your lectures to, each video around a 5-minute, 10 is pushing it range, but that would be a great way to continue learning and instruction. Provide personalized feedback. That's another way to keep the student instructor communication going. When you provide an assignment or give an assignment, follow that up with personalized feedback. Instead of just throwing a grade on there, tell them specifically what they've done right and where they have room for improvement. And then offer support. Make sure students know what your email address is so they can email questions, or set up a discussion board in Canvas for just Q&A. If you have a question, throw it out here on this discussion board. Your peers might be able to help you, but obviously you as the instructor will be checking to sort of help out your students. So just because we're talking about distance learning doesn't mean the interaction between student and instructor should go away. I'm struggling with that word today. Just along those very same lines, another way we can have our students interacting with our lesson is student-to-student interaction. Just because it's online learning doesn't mean we cannot have a social element to our learning. And there are plenty of tools that can help us do that. And quite frankly, I think your students are really going to appreciate that. They're not going to be big fans of being quarantined in their homes any more than any of us are. So there are plenty of tools to have students interact with their classmates even from a distance. So Canvas has discussion boards that are built into it that you can use. As I mentioned, Flipgrid is a way to have discussions not only between student and teacher, but also student to student. They can interact through Google Classroom and tools like Padlet. Obviously, the G Suite is built for collaboration, so you could have collaborative activities still happening even though we're learning from a distance. So think about those things. Can I include student discussions in my lesson? Is there places where I can encourage student collaboration in my lessons? And then, are there opportunities for peer feedback? Canvas has a built-in peer review tool. If you're using Turnitin.com, also there's a peer review tool there. If you haven't used Turnitin.com with your students in class, I might warn against just trying to roll it out now. But if it's something they're used to doing, continue doing that from a distance. So student-to-student interaction is another interaction we don't want to forget about. And then finally, the last interaction is student-to-self. Are we asking our students to reflect on their learning? They're not in your classroom to raise their hand when they have a question. So we want to make sure that we are being intentional about asking them to check for understanding. Are we asking, use Kahoot or quizzes to do quick little formative assessment reviews to check for understanding. Be deliberate about asking your students to reflect on their learning. What did you learn today? Sort of an exit ticket idea can be done digitally just as easily as it can be done in class through using something like a Google form. Encourage your students to ask questions about things they don't understand, whether that's emailing you or setting up some question and answer forum on a platform like Flipgrid or using Canvas discussions. And then ask for feedback. We're all new at this, so your students will appreciate that if at the end of the first week you send out some feedback form that says, what can I do better? How can we make this learning experience better for all of you? Okay, so those are our 5 interactions. Student to interface, student to content, student to instructor, student to student, and student to self. Keep those 5 in mind as you're beginning to plan and implement your lessons. I am obviously here if you have any questions or want to talk about any of this any further.